I feel like at least a couple of the main characters kind of touch base with historical figures in a way. Um, in the Californians, for instance, like Klaus is like a filmmaker in the 1920s, and his career gets cut short pretty early on in his tale. I'm not giving too much away by saying that, but he does come back around. He starts working in early television later on, so he gets to have kind of like two different careers. But in his time when he's a silent filmmaker in the 1920s, he's definitely inspired by uh, film directors like Joseph von Sternberg and uh, Erich von Stroheim, who are both also characters who are of Austrian or German descent, and kind of created a myth around themselves as if they were, of a kind of like upper class, uh, you know, uh, blue blood characters. And basically just invented themselves and made themselves into film directors in the time when, talk about like the Wild West, like when Hollywood was very open, and just there were almost no rules set on directors. And so they made these incredible like artistic achievements, oftentimes way too long, spending a lot of money, before producers realized like, oh, we gotta like stamp this down and get everything under control. Um, and so I kind of borrow a little bit from them and characters like them from the actual historical record to fill out Klaus as a character. And he's kind of one of the founding characters of the book, because it's his granddaughter, um, Di, who's another one of the main characters, Diane Stiegel. Um, and she, like most of her story, is set around the 1980s in New York when she's kind of building her art career. She's a painter and eventually like a kind of conceptual artist later on. Um, but she too, like I drew a lot from the careers of women artists like Cindy Sherman from that time period, or other like I feel like the story of Jean-Michel Basquiat is really well known to people, that that kind of like underground art world of the 1980s, and befriending Warhol and all that kind of cool stuff. Um, and so I tapped in a lot on, into that world for her story. Um, and then of course Toby's set like all in the 2020s. His whole story is in basically 2024, so last year. Um, and he begins his story by, he's escaping a wildfire in Northern California that's going to burn down his whole town. And as we meet him, he's kind of on his way to go steal some paintings that Dye painted, that his father owns. So the story kind of goes in a lot of different directions. They're kind of set in, big chunks of time apart from one another, but they all intertwine too. They've all kind of touched one another. Um, and they're all from two families, either the Stiegels or the Harlans. And as you see, they're really enmeshed families. Um, and a lot of their, everything kind of returns to Palm Springs in different ways. That's where Klaus tried to create a film studio of his own early on in the story. That's where Di kind of decides she wants to be an artist. Um, and that's also where Toby goes to steal some paintings. And we kind of, yeah, we meet all of them and learn at least that much about them. Yeah, I kind of discovered as I went along how they were connected. Like I knew when I started the book, I started with the character of Diane as a young girl, visiting her grandfather when he's like really sick. He's kind of right near the end of his life. Um, and realizing like, okay, well, this guy was this famous filmmaker from 50 years ago for her. So they were already kind of like built in from the beginning. And then really early on in her story, she meets a kid named Track that's her same age, and they become really close friends. They end up, they're they're both from divorced families, and their families kind of join, so they basically become like brother and sister in a way during their teen years. Um, and so that's how kind of they connect. And then Toby is Track's son, and so it's almost like the story, as I kind of discovered their characters and learned how they grew up. That family tree kind of built itself. And then by the end, once the book was done, I was like, the book probably needs an actual family tree for the reader to not lose track. So we went ahead and put one at the beginning. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, there was a lot of, I kind of realized that I wanted to cover all this time, this huge period of American history, basically from the 1920s to the 2020s, the American century. Um, and I realized that, like, in a sense, like each character works on a different timeline or a different speed. Like Klaus, we cover like 50 years of his life, so I had to have these huge jumps between chapters, in his life. Diane, we cover a much shorter period, about 20 years of her life, and so there doesn't have to be as big leaps between chapters. And then Toby, it's basically like a weekend in his life. It's just this kind of like 3 or 4 days that we watch him over a few chapters. I read a bunch of books obsessively. There's this great, I mean, for the 1980s sections for Diane were a lot of fun because, I'm really into like, new wave music, Talking Heads, that kind of stuff. So I was already kind of like drawn to like, okay, I'm into this. I'm into this scene. But there was so much I didn't know. Like I didn't know like, well, what kind of clubs would people go to? What was it like to hang out at the Mud Club? Really, in like 1981 and things like that. And there's a great book. I'm forgetting the author's name, but it's called "Life and Death on the Dance Floor," or on the New York dance floor. And it's this giant. It's like a 600-page book that's just about these clubs and who would have been playing DJ sets at different times, what bands would have played. Who would have been hanging out, what night, in 1982 did David Bowie run into, uh, whoever else, have an argument or something. Um, and that was really a great journey just to really dive into the really nitty gritty details. And even look at kind of the playlists of what the DJs would have been playing, what pop songs they were mixing in with other things. And yeah, so that was a lot of fun. And, on the Google side of things, I mean, it's kind of a weird story, but I was really interested in, and there's a particular club when I was reading that book, at the club called Danceteria, and I was like, okay, they're going to go out some night. They're going to go hang out at this place called Danceteria. It was a really popular place, for especially like the gay scene. Like there was a really popular nightclub type dancing kind of atmosphere. And all I wanted to do was like find a video on YouTube of like, well, what did it look like? Just somebody must have a video of people just dancing at Danceteria. And the first video that popped up when I searched was actually, it was like a tryout video that somebody was filming of women for background dancers for a show at Danceteria. And it was a creepy video. It's basically like somebody's apartment, and it's like one woman after another just like dancing like mechanically as music plays. And I have to tell you, it's a creepy video. But I immediately was like, I have to use this. And it became the opening for one of the chapters of it's even how Di meets a really important character in the novel by going along with her friend and being like, what are we doing here? What's going on in this apartment? So there's a lot of details like that that are, you kind of accidentally bump into them and you're like, oh wow, this is too rich. This has to be in here somewhere. That's a lot of fun too. I mean, I have a lot of fun with like those kind of historical details too. Of like, well, people talked in a different way at different time periods, right? They had different kinds of character to their voices. We use different language. Um, they also like often like in the early periods of the book, like the stuff set in like the 1920s, there are just a lot more characters that are like first generation immigrants. So they're also kind of bringing forward like whatever parts of speech and everything that they're kind of bringing over. Um, there's a character that's really prominent in Klaus's storyline named Artie Banyan, and he's like a capital C character. He's one of these like big gregarious guys. Um, who I kind of tried to pattern his speech after like Jimmy Cagney. Like I wanted him to have this kind of like, machine gun, really hip for the time kind of way to talk. He says a lot of kind of catchphrases in a way. He thinks he's really cool. And so I really had fun like letting loose with him. Um, but on the other hand, with Klaus, like Klaus is often trying to come off as, um, a very genteel, upper crust kind of gentleman character, and he also has a very thick German accent anyway. So he's often like shorter sentences and very to the point and very reticent at times. And yeah, so that's a lot of fun. And the '80s sections were a lot of fun too. Toby's contemporary sections of the book.